Dear people watching and listening, Assalamu alaikum. Kindly like and share this video and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Please support my channel by contributing to my Patreon account so that I can continue making the audiobook series. Salahuddin al-Ayyubi, Volume 1, Crusades prior to the rise of the Ayyubid state. Start of Part 3 of Chapter 4. Noor ad-Deen's military campaigns against Egypt. The Fatimid Wazir Ibn as-Salar, who followed the Sunni madhab, attempted to contact Noor ad-Deen in order to launch a joint attack in which Noor ad-Deen would come with his troops from the north and the Fatimid fleet would attack the Crusader cities on the Syrian coast. Usama ibn Munqidh mediated between the two sides. Ibn as-Salar offered to take money and gifts to the Sultan of Aleppo, offering to besiege Tiberias. At the same time, the Fatimid fleet would attack Gaza. If Nur ad-Din agreed to that, Ibn Munqidh would offer him money to help him, but if he refused, then Ibn Munqidh would use the money to sponsor a number of horsemen to fight the Crusaders at Ascalon. But when he reached Busra and met with Nur ad-Din, he explained to him how preoccupied he was with Damascus, and that it formed an obstacle to his cooperating with the Fatimids, because Damascus had not yet fallen to him. It may be noted that Ibn as-Salar continued his fight against the Crusaders. In 546 Hijri, that is 1151 Common Era, he spent a huge amount of money to prepare a fleet with which he attacked the coastal Crusader cities. Ad-Zahabi spoke of Ibn as-Salar saying, "He was a courageous hero, brave, respected, a Shafi'i Sunni who did not follow the religion of the Ubaidis. He welcomed Salafis and built a school for them, but there was some injustice, transgression, and tyranny in him." These attempts were repeated when Talat ibn Rusak became vizier, as he contacted Nur ad-Din Muhammad via Usama ibn Munqidh, but Nur ad-Din did not hasten to respond, as he thought that the right opportunity had not yet come. Usama ibn Munqidh and the king as-Salih Abul Gharad Talat ibn Rusak exchanged poetry in which jihad against the Franks was mentioned and encouraged. Nur ad-Din did not enter into a military alliance with Talat ibn Rusak, but he paid attention to diplomatic communications. In 552 Hijri, that is 1157 Common Era, a delegation from Nur ad-Din arrived, and the same thing happened again in 553 Hijri, that is 1158 Common Era. The Fatimid state responded to those delegations by sending Nur ad-Din's ambassador back to his country with gifts and weapons estimated at a value of 30,000 dinars, and other kinds of supplies worth an estimated 70,000 to support Nur ad-Din's struggle against the Crusaders. There was a further delegation from Nur ad-Din in 554 Hijri, that is 1159 Common Era. On the other hand, the Fatimid state showed a friendly face to him. In 555 Hijri, that is 1160 Common Era, Al-Adid sent gifts to him. In fact, the logical explanation for this is that after the Fatimids lost Ashkelon in 548 Hijri, that is 1153 Common Era, they realized, more than before, the danger that the Crusaders posed to them and the necessity of benefiting from the strength of Nur ad-Din's state and its political and military power. Nur ad-Din's motives for conquering Egypt. The conquest of Egypt was one of the greatest achievements of Nur ad-Din. May Allah have mercy on him. He managed to bring down the Ubaidi Fatimid state, which for more than 2 centuries had been spreading political corruption and false beliefs throughout the Muslim world. They were the ones who had helped the Crusaders to occupy Greater Syria by means of their alliance and conspiracies with them. They are the ones who adopted the Batini madhab and spread it among the Muslims. When chaos prevailed in the Fatimid administration and the viziers took control instead of the caliphs, the Crusaders began to hope that they could invade Egypt. So they attacked it time after time, whereupon Noor ad-Deen Mahmud sent a military campaign to save Egypt from their ambitions, bring it back to the madhab of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, and unite the Muslims. We may sum up the important motives that led to the conquest of Egypt as follows. There was a state of chaos that prevailed in Egypt at the end of the Fatimid Caliphate. The state was suffering from many manifestations of disintegration and corruption. It had become something common for the caliph or vizier to be killed during the ongoing conflicts among the viziers themselves and between the viziers and the caliphs. Ad-Zahir was killed by his viziers, and the viziers took control after that and chose whomever they wanted. And the viziers killed one another. In 1 year, 3 different viziers were appointed to the post: Al-Adil ibn Ruzak, Shawar, and Dirgham. The state grew weak and chaos prevailed throughout the land. At the end of his conflict, Shawar left Egypt after he was expelled by Dirgham. Then he sought help from Noor ad-Deen, who found his long-awaited opportunity to achieve Islamic unity between Syria and Egypt. The Crusaders' hopes led the Mujahid commander Noor ad-Deen to think seriously about incorporating Egypt into the Islamic front. He also received confirmation from the Abbasid Caliph, giving him a free hand in Syria and Egypt in 549 Hijri, which reinforced his resolve to achieve this goal. One of the strongest reasons for the destruction of the Ubaydi Fatimid Caliphate was the ideological factor. It was a state that was Batini in its belief and Ismaili in its madhab. It divided the Muslims and conspired repeatedly with their enemies. So it was essential to form a united front that was strong in its belief and legitimate, incorporating both Egypt and Syria under the banner of the Abbasid Caliphate. In these circumstances in which the martyr Noor ad-Deen was thinking of invading Egypt, the Fatimid Vizier Shawar ibn Mujir as-Sadi arrived in Damascus in 559 Hijri, seeking his help against the one who had usurped his position by force. In return for Noor ad-Deen's help, Shawar promised him 1/3 of the annual income of Egypt, after paying the soldiers' salaries, and to act as his deputy in Egypt, if he helped him to overcome his enemy Dirgham. Asad ad-Din Shirkuh would stay with the troops in Egypt and run the country's affair with Shawar under the authority of Noor ad-Deen. But Noor ad-Deen was hesitant, taking 1 step forward and 1 step back, until he prayed to Allah for guidance concerning this matter, because there were great dangers represented in the Crusader presence on the coast and in Jerusalem, in addition to his doubts about the sincerity of Shawar as-Sadi. Then Noor ad-Deen prepared a number of consecutive campaigns and sent them to Egypt between 559 and 564 Hijri, under the leadership of Asad ad-Din Shirkuh. The first campaign of Noor ad-Deen, in 559 Hijri, that is 1164 Common Era. Noor ad-Deen Mahmud decided to send a military campaign to Egypt under the leadership of Asad ad-Din Shirkuh to achieve 2 initial aims. A. To be able to examine the internal situation in Egypt closely as a first step towards incorporating it, especially since Shawar had promised him that if he returned to his post, he would bear the costs of the expedition and guarantee that Asad ad-Din Shirkuh and his troops could stay in Egypt. B. Reinstating Shawar, the deposed Fatimid vizier. Dirgham found out about the preparations that were being made in Damascus for a campaign to help Shawar, so he took precautions and sought the help of Amalric I in an attempt to enter the balance of power game. He made a deal with him for his help against Noor ad-Din Mahmud, promising him in return that he would pay an annual tribute to be determined by the king. He also agreed that Egypt would become a vassal state of the Crusaders, and he forced the Fatimid Caliph al-Adid to sign this deal. Naturally, Amalric I accepted this offer, as it gave him the opportunity that he could not miss to enter Egypt, which was a goal for which the Crusaders had been striving for more than half a century. So he immediately prepared a military expedition to march on Egypt. Asad ad-Din Shirkuh set out, leading the first campaign to Egypt in Jumadil Akhirah 559 Hijri, that is April 1164 Common Era, accompanied by his nephew Salahaddin Yusuf ibn Ayyub, who was approximately 17 years old. They followed the route already decided upon, which passed through lands under Crusader control. In order to distract them from intercepting this campaign and to protect the soldiers' lives, Noor ad-Din did two things. A. He accompanied the campaign with his own army as far as the outskirts of Damascus to prevent anyone intercepting the troops. B. He launched attacks on the northern edges of the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem, which neighbored Damascus, to distract Crusader attention from Egypt. Asad ad-Din Shirkuh led his huge army across the desert, accompanied by Shawar. They passed Kirak, then Ashaubak, also known as Crac to Montreal, and Eilat. Then they reached Suez and from there went on to Cairo. They traveled so quickly that they had passed the channel of Suez before the Crusaders were ready to intervene. Dirgham sent a military force led by a brother of his called Nasir-ud-Din to confront them. But the encounter between the two sides ended in a clear victory for Asad ad-Din Shirkuh, and Nasir-ud-Din returned to Cairo in defeat, pursued by Asad ad-Din Shirkuh. At the end of Jamadiul Akhirah, he reached the Egyptian capital, and Dirgham came out to meet him with all the forces at his disposal, because he realized that this was the final battle. The battle took place under the walls of Cairo. It was a violent clash which ended in victory for Asad ad-Din Shirkuh after the army, the people, and the caliph abandoned Dirgham. Dirgham was killed near the supposed shrine of Sayyida Nafisa, as he attempted to flee in Rajab 559 Hijri, that is June 1164 Common Era. Then his brother Nasir ad-Din was killed, and Asad ad-Din Shirkuh entered Cairo in victory, reinstated Shawar as vizier, and set up his camp outside the city. After his reinstatement was guaranteed, Shawar went back to his old ways of plotting and deceiving in order to start a new conflict with Asad ad-Din Shirkuh. He mistreated the people and forgot the promises that he had made to Noor ad-Din Mahmud. Indeed, signs of treachery soon appeared. He broke his treaty with him and asked Shirkuh to leave Egypt immediately, taking his troops back to Syria. But Shirkuh refused to do so and reacted to his about-face by hastening to capture Bilbis and taking over the eastern part of the country. Shawar had no choice but to seek help from King Amalric I, who was preparing to march on Egypt. He began to make him scared of Noor ad-Din Mahmud and suggested the following to him. C. He would give him 1,000 dinars for every stage of the journey from Jerusalem to the Nile. The number of stages was 27. D. He would give gifts to each of the knights hospitalier who accompanied him. They formed the backbone of the army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. This was an attempt to entice these knights to take part in the kingdom. E. He would pay for food for their horses in return for help in expelling Asad ad-Din Shirkuh from Egypt. Thus Shawar indulged in a political game between major enemies in an attempt to incite them against one another to serve his own interests. Undoubtedly, Amalric I was watching political and military developments in Egypt at that time, and when he learned of Asad ad-Din Shirkuh's march, his fear increased. So when Shawar's invitation reached him, he welcomed it and did not waste this opportunity to enter Egypt, even though it was with a different ally. That did not bother him in the least. All that mattered to him was entering Egypt. Amalric I's second campaign against Egypt. Amalric I's campaign against Egypt failed, and he was forced to withdraw and return to Jerusalem. That was in 558 Hijri, that is 1163 Common Era. When he got another opportunity to enter Egypt, as soon as he received Shawar's invitation, Amalric I hastened to hold a council in Jerusalem, summoning the barons of the kingdom. He decided to accept Shawar's invitation after explaining to the council that he was able to prepare a campaign to invade Egypt without weakening the kingdom's defenses. At that time, a number of pilgrims had arrived from Europe to visit Jerusalem, and he could make use of them in his war effort in hopes of occupying Egypt for the Crusaders. He decided to appoint Bohemond III, ruler of Antioch, in charge of the kingdom's affairs in his absence. The king of Jerusalem hastened to march on Egypt at the head of his forces for the second time, in Ramadan 559 Hijri, that is August 1164 Common Era. As soon as he arrived in Faqus, he hastened to contact Shawar and they agreed to besiege Asad ad-Din Shirkuh in Bilbis. This fortress withstood the siege for 3 months, during which Asad ad-Din Shirkuh defended his position. Then Amalric I suddenly decided to enter into negotiations with him for both parties to leave Egypt. What happened on the political level to make him take this step? Here we see the unique military genius of Noor ad-Deen. Amalric I had received the troubling news from Syria that his kingdom was being subjected to pressure by Noor ad-Din Mahmud, and he preferred to go back and defend it. At the same time, he realized that his campaign was doomed to failure because of Asad ad-Din Shirkuh's fortifications in Bilbis. Asad ad-Din Shirkuh was also in a difficult situation because his food supplies had started to run out, in addition to the fact that the combined Crusader-Fatimid forces were superior in numbers and the military situation was not in his favor. Hence he agreed to enter into negotiations to leave Egypt. The two men did indeed reach an agreement to leave Egypt in Dhul Hijjah, that is October. The Muslim and Crusader armies traveled along parallel routes across the Sinai Peninsula, after leaving Shawar in control of running affairs. Shirkuh was the last to leave the country and catch up with his troops. Shawar was the real winner of this conflict, which ended in his favor. He got rid of both the Syrian Muslim and Crusader armies at the same time as he got rid of Dirgham, and over the next 2 years, he became the man in control in the country. After his return from Egypt, Asad ad-Din Shirkuh put himself at the disposal of Noor ad-Din Mahmud, and Egypt became the focal point of Asad ad-Din Shirkuh's thinking and talk in his meetings with others. He never stopped exchanging ideas about it with his friends, who would keep him up to date with its news. During this period, Noor ad-Din Mahmud sent him on a mission to Baghdad, where he made the most of his being in the capital of the Caliphate, to stir up the enthusiasm of the Caliph al-Mustanjid Billah, as he started to tell him all about Egypt and what he himself had seen there. The Caliph was moved by what he heard and encouraged him to return there. In spite of the fact that Asad ad-Din Shirkuh's campaign did not achieve its aims in Egypt, the final outcome was that Nur ad-Din Mahmud's power in Syria was reinforced and his status in the Muslim world was raised. He became the major local power in the region, whilst the area under Crusader control receded to the coast, and they began to despair. Whatever the case, both Shirkuh and Amalric I left Egypt, and each of them found out about its deteriorating political and economic situation, in addition to finding out about the abundant wealth and huge human resources that it enjoyed, which would tip the balance in favor of the one who took control of it. Shawar took the opportunity presented by the departure of both to go back to his original attitude, oppressing and killing and confiscating the people's wealth, to such an extent that the Fatimid Caliph al-Adid had no authority at all. When the situation got completely out of hand, al-Adid wrote to Nur ad-Din Mahmud, seeking his help to get rid of Shawar. Nur ad-Din's second campaign. Nur ad-Din Mahmud prepared the necessary forces and sent them to Egypt in Rabiul Awwal, 562 Hijri, that is January 1167 Common Era, under the leadership of Asad ad-Din Shirkuh, who was accompanied by his nephew Salahaddin. He also sent a number of emirs with him, and the number of these troops was 2,000 horsemen. Nur ad-Din accompanied them to the edge of his land, for fear of Crusader interception. The troops in this campaign followed a route that was surrounded with danger. The Crusaders in their path, who were lying in wait in Kerak and Afshobak, could ambush them and wreak havoc when they were far away from their own territory, and the Bedouin were pursuing them to transmit information about them to the Crusaders. They had to change course occasionally to hide themselves. Nature also slowed their progress. A heavy sandstorm struck them, killing some of their men and destroying some of their provisions. Despite that, they reached Egypt. Shawar had enough time to seek help again from Amalric I, as he was certain from his reading of events that if Asad ad-Din Shirkuh came to Egypt this time, he would stay and would not leave. Therefore, he did not hesitate to contact the king of Jerusalem and negotiate with him, explaining to him the danger that Nur ad-Din Mahmud would pose to the kingdom of Jerusalem if he succeeded in taking possession of Egypt. Amalric I welcomed Shawar's invitation in hopes of taking control of Egypt and pushing away Nur ad-Din Mahmud and his army from it, so that they would not be able to surround his kingdom, which would otherwise end up in the middle of Nur ad-Din Mahmud's possessions. But before the preparations were complete, news came that Asad ad-Din Shirkuh was crossing the Sinai Desert. Amalric I could not do more than send whatever troops he could find to slow down his progress. But this arrangement came too late. Although Asad ad-Din Shirkuh's army was hit by a sandstorm that halted their progress and almost wiped them out, he arrived safely at the Channel of Suez in Rabiul Thani, that is early February. Asad ad-Din Shirkuh learned that the Crusader army had started to march towards Egypt, at which point he crossed the desert heading southwest, in order to avoid a premature confrontation with the Crusaders, until he reached the Nile at Itfi, 40 miles south of Cairo. Then he crossed to the west bank of the river, and stayed close to the river as he marched until he reached Giza, where he camped opposite Al-Fustat, and he gained control of the western side of the country and ruled it for 50 odd days. Amalric's third campaign and Crusader-Fatimid negotiations. Amalric I set out from Jerusalem in Rabiul Awwal, 562 Hijri, that is January 1167 Common Era, heading for Egypt in the third campaign against that land. He followed the usual route from Gaza to Al-Arish, then he crossed the desert to Bilbis. Shawar was surprised by his sudden appearance and started to get worried because he had not coordinated with him. It seems that he did not know of Shirkuh's arrival in Itfi and was not certain until he sent his scouts to the desert to find out what was happening, at which point he went out to welcome the Crusader king and meet with him. He invited Amalric I to stay in his camp on the eastern bank of the Nile, 1 mile from the walls of Cairo. He held discussions with Shawar in which Shawar agreed to pay 400,000 dinars in return for driving Asad ad-Din Shirkuh out of Egypt, with half of this amount to be paid immediately and the other half to be paid later on. He also stipulated that Amalric I should swear to that in order to support this agreement and make it official. Amalric I sent Hugh, ruler of Caesarea, and Geoffrey, commander of the Knights Hospitalier, to the Fatimid Caliph to obtain from him his official agreement to this deal. The two envoys were warmly welcomed in the Fatimid palace, and the deal was confirmed. It was natural for the Crusaders to welcome this agreement, which made them the protectors of Egypt and the Fatimid Caliphate, and pushed away Asad ad-Din Shirkuh, as he was their only competitor for control of this land. The Battle of Babayn. Asad ad-Din and Noor ad-Deen's troops marched to As-Said, that is Upper Egypt, and reached a place called Al-Babayn, also known as Two Gates. The Egyptian and Frankish troops set out after them and caught up with them on 25 Jamadul Awwal. Shirkuh had sent spies to them, who came back and told him about their great numbers and equipment, and how persistent they were in seeking him. So he decided to meet them and fight, and let the sword judge between him and them. But he was worried that his companions' resolve might be weakened in this dangerous situation, in which destruction was more likely than safety, because of their lack of numbers and their being so far from home. So he consulted them, and they all advised him to cross the Nile to the eastern side and go back to Syria. They said to him, "If we are defeated, which there is no doubt about, where will we seek refuge and who will protect us, when everyone in this land, soldier, ordinary person or peasant, is an enemy to us and wishes to drink our blood? It is natural for an army of 2,000 horsemen, who are so far away from home and have no supporters, to be afraid to meet tens of thousands, in addition to knowing that the local people are also our enemies." When they said that, one of Noor ad-Deen's Mamluks, who was called Sharaf ad-Din Buzghush, who was famed for his courage, stood up and said, "Whoever fears death and injury and capture should not serve kings. Rather he should be a peasant or stay with the women at home. By Allah, if you go back to Al-Malik al-Adil, that is Noor ad-Deen, without gaining victory or doing your best to be free from blame, he will take away all the land that he has given you, and will take back all that you have taken until today. And he will say to you, 'Did you take the Muslims' wealth and then flee from their enemies, and leave this land of Egypt under the control of the disbelievers?'" Asad ad-Din said, "This is my opinion, and it is what I am going to do." Salahaddin Yusuf ibn Ayyub agreed with him. Then the number of those who agreed to fight increased, and they all agreed to meet the enemy in battle. This shows the esteem in which Noor ad-Deen was held in the hearts of the commanders and troops of his army. Shirkuh stayed put until the Egyptians and Franks caught up with him, when he was fully mobilized. Here we see the military genius and expertise of Asad ad-Din Shirkuh. He put all the wealth and food supplies in the middle, because he could not leave them in any other place, lest the local people plunder them. Then he put Salahaddin, his nephew, in the middle, and said to him and those who were with him, "If the Franks and Egyptians think that I am at the heart of the army, they will intensify their attack on the heart, and that will be the focus of their attack. If they attack you, do not try to withstand the attack, and do not kill yourselves. Rather run away from them. If they give up and turn back, then chase them." From among the most courageous of his companions, he chose a group whom he trusted and knew of their patience and courage, and he stood with them on the right flank. When the two groups met, the Franks did what Asad ad-Din had mentioned. They attacked the heart, thinking that he was among them, so they fought those who were in the heart lightly. Then they fled before them and they followed them, at which point Asad ad-Din and the men who were with him attacked the Franks in the rear of those who had attacked the heart. They defeated them and wielded their swords against them, killing and capturing a great number of them, and the rest fled. When the Franks who had fled came back to the heart of the battlefield to look for their companions, they found no one there. So they fled again, and this is one of the most amazing things ever written in history, that 2,000 horsemen defeated the armies of the Egyptians and the Franks of the coast. The Siege of Alexandria. Then Asad ad-Din went back to Alexandria and collected taxes on the way from the towns and villages. Then he came to Alexandria and gained control of it without fighting. Its people surrendered it to him. He appointed his nephew Salahaddin as his deputy in the city, and returned to Upper Egypt, where he gained control and collected taxes, and stayed there and fasted Ramadan there. The Egyptians and Franks went back to Cairo, where they gathered their supporters and replaced those who had been killed. They collected more troops and mobilized, and marched to Alexandria, where Salahaddin was with his troops, protecting it from them, helped by its people who were afraid of the Franks. The siege intensified, and food supplies ran low in the city, but its people persevered. Asad ad-Din came towards them from Upper Egypt, but Shawar had corrupted some of the Turkmens who were with him. Then a messenger came from the Egyptians and Franks, seeking a peace deal. Negotiations concerning withdrawal from Egypt. After negotiations between Noor ad-Din Mahmud and the Crusaders, a peace deal was drawn up, based on the following: A. Lifting the siege of Alexandria. B. Exchanging prisoners. C. Letting the troops of Noor ad-Din leave Alexandria. D. Shirkuh and his troops would leave Egypt. E. They were not to be intercepted en route by the Crusader forces. From a careful reading of the course of events as they occurred on the ground, the exchange of offers with regard to making the truce, and what happened after the agreement was concluded, we may note that the two sides, Noor ad-Din's troops and the Crusader-Fatimid troops, agreed to the following. F. Noor ad-Din's troops and the Crusaders would leave Egypt. G. Prisoners would be exchanged. H. Shawar promised not to punish his people in Alexandria or elsewhere who had supported Asad ad-Din Shirkuh. Whatever the case, Amalric entered the city of Alexandria in Shawwal, that is August, whilst Salahaddin left it in a splendid military procession, despite the sorrow that its inhabitants felt at his departure. The two men met and were impressed with one another to such an extent that the king of Jerusalem supplied Salahaddin with some boats to transfer the wounded Muslim warriors to Syria. But the problems of the city's inhabitants did not stop there. As soon as Shawar's followers entered the city, they arrested everyone who was suspected of cooperating with Salahaddin. The latter protested to Amalric I, who advised Shawar to let the prisoners go. This was the second time that Shawar acted treacherously, and it taught Salahaddin a harsh lesson not to try it again. He himself settled the score with Shawar when the Syrian forces returned to Egypt in 564 Hijri, that is 1168 Common Era. Crusader protection for Egypt. Asad-ad-Din Shirkuh and Salahuddin both left Egypt in Zulqa'dah, that is September, whereas Amalric tarried for a few weeks, because he went to Cairo to confirm the Crusader protection of the Fatimid state and Shawar. The most important implications of that were: 1. He would pay an annual tribute of 100,000 dinars to the Crusaders. 2. A force of knights would guard the gates of Cairo to ward off Noor ad-Din Mahmud if he tried to attack again. 3. A representative of the Crusader kingdom would stay in Cairo to participate in ruling the country. It seems that the idea of taking possession of Egypt was still alive in the mind of Amalric I, and he was no longer able to give up this idea. He intended to come back after he had sorted out the situation in Syria, out of greed for its wealth and to protect his kingdom in Syria. Then the king returned to Palestine. By means of these procedures, he ensured protection of Egypt, which resulted in ongoing competition between Noor ad-Din Mahmud and Amalric. End of part 3 of chapter 4.